Welcome to Voices of the Valley, a captivating podcast series that brings together some of the brightest minds in the agriculture industry. Straight from the field to your living room, we explore the challenges, innovation, and triumphs in modern-day farming and provide insight for consumers who are curious about where their food comes from. Today we have a wonderful Voices of the Valley conversation in store for you. Our guest is Cannon Michael, President and CEO of Bolles Farming Company. He is the sixth generation of his family to work in the family farming business. Thank you for joining us today, Cannon.
It's an honor to be here, Corey. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You got it. Tell me about the farming operations of Bolles Farming Company. What crops do you grow?
Sure. I think maybe the better question is what we're not growing, but we have a lot of diversity. It wasn't always that way, but we've changed quite a bit. So a lot of vegetable crops. Our primary crop, the largest acres, are tomatoes, which would be processing and fresh market tomatoes. We actually still grow some extra long staple cotton, which is a crop that's near and dear to my heart. We've been doing cotton for a long, long time, but also do carrots, garlic, and onions, which we sort of say are our winter crops. We do both fresh and dehy garlic and onions, so that's sort of a little different varietals, but same agronomic practices. And then big melon program now, which is watermelons, cantaloupes, honeydew melons, and mixed melons. And then we've expanded a sweet corn program. So we're, if we have water available after our carrots, we're generally harvesting the carrots and then planting sweet corn right after that. So on top of that, we've got a small specialty wheat program. My sister actually is running some bakeries up in the Bay Area, and we're shipping wheat grown here on the farm directly to her that's being milled in the Bay Area by her into flour and made into a lot of amazing sourdough breads and other things. And so that's been exciting. We do some cilantro, basil. We also have some pistachios and almonds on the permanent crop side, but that's a much smaller kind of part of what we do. So 90+% of what we're doing are annual crops, vegetable type crops. And then we do farm in a very interesting ecological area where we are essentially tending and managing habitat. We sit adjacent to the Grasslands Wildlife Management Area, which is the second largest contiguous wetlands in the United States. So about 200,000 acres of wetlands, and we have about 650 acres. Doesn't exactly sound like farming, but it actually is. We work in concert with the biologists at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to come up with annual work plans, because we actually need to have more than just the water when the birds arrive here in the fall, part of the migratory. This is a huge part of the Pacific Flyway here, but we need to have calories for those birds to continue. They don't just need a place to sit. So we're growing essentially native plants that have a lot of seed production, and that takes irrigation events actually during the season. So we'll put water out, first of all, water in the spring for the birds to have brood habitat to rear their babies, the local birds, and then we're also irrigating at periodic intervals to also increase the amount of seed that the birds will find when they get here to help them have the caloric intake they need to continue on the amazing journeys that they take all the way from as far north as Alaska and through Canada and all the way down here through and down to Mexico. So it's another aspect of farming I don't think people would even think about, but it's a big part of our location is very unique in that our entire western border is really this interesting wetlands area.
Yeah, we'll get into the habitat restoration projects you guys are involved in later on in the podcast here. With such a diverse mix of crops and other activities on the farm, how do you keep everything straight? It sounds like you're doing more than is humanly possible to keep track of.
It's a lot. You know, I didn't totally touch on it, but I'm very involved in water issues. I serve on our local water district board, which also then puts me as a board member of a larger 4-entity group called the Exchange Contractors. I sit on that board, and I'm also the chairman of the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority. So water obviously is a huge input for farming. It's a strategic input for us here at Bolles Farming Company. Due to our long history, we have access to water that's kind of unique in the valley. So a lot of my time of my role is dedicated a lot to water, but then I also obviously want to be involved in the strategic progression of the farm, and I've been very involved in that, but I also have cultivated a great team of people. And so I think you're really are depending on having a great team. I'm not a micromanager. I love to get people empowered and get them active and get the right people in the right spots. And so I've been very fortunate to have really good people working with me, which allows me to have the ability to deal with the water issues, and then also just balance just all the demands of family and work and all those things. So it definitely is a team effort here at Bolles Farming Company.
And we'll dig more into the water as well as we move along here. I've been around a lot of family operations in agriculture, and it's common to see farms in their third or fourth generation. Once you get into the fifth and sixth generation, you are entering rarefied air. In one sentence, how do you account for the lasting farming legacy in your family?
If I could be flippant, I'd say it was so big at one point it was hard to tear it down. But I think the family really did. We have a very interesting history in that we had a visionary leader, which not every family gets. So it had somebody who built a huge operation. For all the good things he did, he was not very good at planning or wanting to really plan for the future. He was just a very interesting, the way that he was wired. And so, when he passed on, it left things a little bit rudderless for a while, and it just took time for the family to kind of find its feet. But again, it was a much larger operation. We're not as large as what he had built, but we're still going after 6 generations. But I think it does come from ultimately family, respect for each other and being willing to, have tough conversations. And, just there is the longevity just sort of inherently connects you to the land and connects you to, the history of California. And I think so people want to find ways to stay together. But, family businesses are not easy, and they're not easy to keep together. But we've been fortunate to carry on into the 6th generation. I think it's very rare to get past the 3rd generation, as you said. But we're very proud of the legacy. We've continued to adapt and change, which I think is also something that family businesses have to be ready to do. And it's certainly not easy to do. So, yeah, I'm proud of our family. But, yeah, it took a real visionary to start the whole thing. And it takes a lot of hard work and effort and a commitment to family to keep it going.
And you do have a fascinating origin story for the Bowles Farming Company. Your origins are in a company called Miller and Lux, which was founded by your great-great-great-grandfather?
You got it, 3 greats.
Is that right? Yep. 3 greats. So that was in 1858. Miller and Lux was founded. That was more than 165 years ago, before even the Civil War began, which is mind-boggling. Fun fact, 1858 was also the same year they completed the first transatlantic telegraph cable between Europe and North America. Go figure. Now back to the story. Henry Miller and his partner Charles Lux were 2 San Francisco butchers, both German immigrants, and they created an industrial enterprise that helped transform the American West. They are the subject of a fascinating book called Industrial Cowboys. Can you give us a thumbnail sketch of Industrial Cowboys? Talk a little bit about your great-great-great-grandfather and the origins of the Bowles Farming Company.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's an amazing immigrant story. Both Lux and Miller were very young German immigrants who sort of had a similar background, and they were apprentice butchers back in the small towns that they grew up in Germany. American dream, made it out to the United States, ended up in San Francisco, started as competitors with each other, and then decided it might be better to join forces. Very unique partnership in that Lux really didn't like to be out on the landscape in terms of riding on a horse for days and doing all that. Obviously the travel back then was like that, but Miller loved to be out riding around and seeing what was going on and judging the cattle and all those things. And so you have to reverse and think back. California 1850s was a place of huge opportunity, a lot of people coming to seek their fortunes. Not a lot of people probably were thinking as much on the feeding all those people, and so really was right place, right time in a lot of ways, because these influx of people were going to need reliable food. Miller saw early on that he could change the genetics of the cattle. They were typical breeds in the valley at the time he were here were much kind of scrawnier, not very good meat producers, and so really innovative things that they did. And California was really an island because you had the Sierra Nevada mountain range, so you didn't have refrigerated rail and all that. So they really were, not only right place, right time, but they did a lot of unique things. Like I said, brought different cattle. They went out to the Midwest and drove 2,000 head of cattle, was kind of their first venture together in 1858 to populate, their lands with these new breeds of cattle. And California was a wild place back then too. We didn't have any of the water infrastructure that we have now. We talk a lot about climate change and think about that, but one of Miller's quotes that I love was that every year in California is a drought year until it reveals itself otherwise. Mm-hmm. So he saw right away that they're going to get really, really dry years and then sometimes super wet years. Our unique Mediterranean climate just sort of lends itself to that on-off kind of switch. And so he saw that, they knew they needed to get like a large land footprint in order to be kind of dealing just with the lack of the infrastructure, because they had to get close to the rivers when there was a drought. They had to get away from them where there's too much water. So anyway, it was a wild kind of a story, and again, very successful. Lux unfortunately passed away in the 1880s and pretty early on in their partnership, and Miller continued on and took the company to be one of the largest vertically integrated meat packing operations, and fed a lot of people and created a lot of jobs, and did a lot of good things in a state where there was a lot of challenges at the time to be able to do what they did. So, and he also did some saved the last herd of Tule elk in the valley, and that's the same herd of elk that has now like repopulated a lot of the valley. So he had his cowboys herd them and protect them as the land was changing and developing. And so anyway, interesting guy, and he actually did a lot in the courtroom too to deal with the water, setting up the water rights, setting up the water system that we have. Startups back at that time were more about how to move products on barges and canals, and so he would let them come through his land. But when they failed in their startups because it didn't pencil out, he still had the infrastructure of these canals that were built. And then he designed all the irrigation systems, and a lot of those same irrigation systems are ones that this area still uses to this day. So again, he had a huge impact. A lot of people, I think, kind of lost the history of it, but a guy named David Eigler, who was a professor, did that book that you mentioned, Industrial Cowboys. Miller was a prolific writer, and a lot of what his original writings are all at the Bancroft Library at Berkeley. And so David Eigler went through and looked at all the different texts and did a lot of research. And so anyway, it's an interesting history. Bowles essentially was an offshoot of down the chain. Just a Bowles married a Nickel, who was another family line of the Henry Miller branch. And so anyway, that sort of started. Bowles Farming Company was sort of started at the end of the division between the Nickel and the Bowles family. There were some divisions that happened there, and so kind of splintered the family a little bit in the 60s, and then it's when Bowles Farming Company started. And so anyway, long history, but
very fascinating. Again, the book Industrial Cowboys.
Yeah, Industrial Cowboys. It's a good read. Anybody interested in California agriculture and water history would be wise to take a look at it.
Terrific. I'll put that on my list for sure.
Yeah.
Now, talking about your own journey, your own history, you weren't always destined to take over the family business. Tell me about your own personal journey. How did your path eventually lead back to the Bowles Farming Company?
So the farm was always part of my growing up. I grew up in San Francisco proper, but my grandfather and my great uncle were running the farm when I was young and growing up. And so I would come down often to have the freedom. Growing up in San Francisco was very different in that you don't have, it's a lot of concrete that you're playing on, and to be able to open the car door and run for miles and, have a dirt bike or a little go-kart and be able to have that freedom. And, I love the nice warm summers and, swimming and just seeing the, agriculture around me. So it was always resonated with me. And then even in high school, I wanted to kind of learn more about the business. So I worked on the farm from age 13 till 17. I actually worked for the Boswell Company. My 18th summer went down to Australia and worked down in one of their operations down there. So agriculture was of interest, but our farm wasn't always a place that just because you were part of the family, you instantly went and worked there. We had sort of a different structure than that. And so my great uncle and my uncle were running the business while I was in college, and didn't seem to be an immediate need for me. And so I thought, get interested in something else and look for another opportunity. And that for me was in commercial real estate. And so I went back to Atlanta, Georgia at around the time of the Olympics, and just a lot of activity was happening and kind of an exciting time back then. And so went ahead and got involved with commercial real estate, and was on a totally different career path. Some family health issues ended up coming up here in the farm, and ended up having some discussions with the family. And I was the eldest in my generation who was kind of had some work experience and was out of college and had the history of wanting to be part of the operation. And so came back, and as they say, the rest is history, really. So. Mm-hmm.
And how does the seventh generation feel about the family business? Do you see your kids or anyone else in the seventh generation taking over one day?
So all my 3 sons were raised here on the farm, and a lot of family does come and visit the farm, but a lot of them have not actually been born and raised in the valley. So I think maybe there's a thought that one of my sons would be involved at this point. They're 20, 22, and 24, and just kind of exploring what they're going to do as young men. And so would love to have one of them come back. I think they have it in their they have a love for the valley. They have a love for agriculture that, they've seen a lot of that. But we have an active family. We have a family board where we do have input from family members. Obviously we reach out, have meetings, and do monthly newsletters and things to keep people involved. Even the crop mix, I feel like we're growing is more accessible. For a long time, we were growing barley, cotton, and alfalfa, which are things that you don't maybe want to give your neighbors too much of. But now to be growing watermelons and tomatoes and carrots and garlic, and it's even kind of, I think, connects the family in a different way than we were in the past also. And so, I think we've got, hopefully more people be interested. I think the farm's become much more interesting over the past few years. We're doing things with, precision ag technology. We've got amazing partners that we work with. We're doing really interesting things on the cotton side of the business where we actually have some direct to brand relationships. And so, it's a dynamic business, whether somebody wants to be the CEO or just be involved. Maybe there's opportunities. Agriculture is interesting in that, a farm can be, you can get a part of your career can be with dealing with the accounting or the financial aspects of it. We've got, some media aspects, I think, or branding opportunities. You've got the technology aspects, so you've got the habitat aspects. You've got, there's a lot of different aspects and components that somebody could get involved with. And so I think as we've evolved as a business, there's opportunities that people could come in. We offer family internships, so that we've had a number of our, my cousins have availed themselves of coming and working on the farm. So I think, we want to be as inclusive and open as possible and just find ways to get people involved. And whether, I've got examples of other companies, farming companies that have hired outside people to manage maybe some of the day-to-day operations, but certainly doesn't mean that the family can't continue to be involved. And so I think just like the farm evolved over the years, the management will evolve and the family connectivity. But at the end of the day, we've got a long legacy and a lot of pride and want people to stay involved. So hopefully I'm building something that people want to be a part of.
Absolutely. And if and when that day comes, when you pass the reins over to the next generation, what are your hopes and dreams for your children, for the future of Bolles Farming Company?
Yeah, I'd certainly just want to build, a resilient business that can carry on for the future. Really the things we're doing now with our employees are really important to me. I think giving opportunities to people, farm is something I think that we see, we're transforming, seeds into food ultimately, and that process is really rewarding. I think watching people grow and take opportunities is also really rewarding, and grow in terms of we have a leadership development program for the farm. So we're transitioning hourly people into salaried positions. We've got 8 different people that we've elevated over the last few years that are doing amazing jobs. We've got, the kids of a lot of the workers. We're giving opportunities with scholarships and a lot of other family support, and we see these kids going off to be PhDs and running multiple companies, and it's just rewarding to see the people aspect of it, and that part of it is really interesting. But I hope our farm can just continue to provide good jobs, provide great products, healthy, good food to people, good fiber, and all these different things that we're able to do here.
Absolutely. Let's shift gears just a bit. You talked earlier about your habitat restoration project. I know you take great pride in your contribution to the environment. What is your philosophy on sustainability, and what practices are you using today to ensure that your farm is around for generations to come?
Yeah, I think, having 165 plus years really on the same piece of land connects us to it in different ways. I was sort of educated in around 2012. We actually had the folks from Audubon on the farm looking at how we were managing our alfalfa. We were growing a lot of alfalfa at the time, but I took them around the farm because I thought it's an interesting area where we're farming. We have these corridors that run through the farm that are parts of the San Joaquin River, parts of the farm that we're not growing crops on, but they are natural areas that run through the farm. And I showed those to them thinking I'm showing them all this really good habitat just because it wasn't farmland. And they actually told me a lot of what I had showed them were invasive weeds and things that probably weren't where they should be. And so that sort of opened my mind to, I can be looking at the farming side and what we're doing there and maybe understand the tomatoes and how to do that. But I didn't really understand what were the valuable native crops and what the habitat should be looking like. And so it was really interesting because the folks at Audubon and some of the other NGOs that we ended up working with wanted to lend their support to collaborating with us to help us make the most out of what we had. And so we were able to get some grant money. We were able to, put in our own in-kind money and figure out how to do a really interesting restoration corridor throughout the farm. And, that was a really instructive process for me to just understand that there's people out there with the capacity and the knowledge that can also help you in areas where, again, we hadn't done anything intentionally wrong, but we just didn't have the skill set to manage our habitat. And so that we embarked upon that process, and it brought a lot of value. And now we kind of understand how to maximize the habitat, and we designed it with a specific pollinator component where we can help support, we rely a lot on bees and pollination around the farm. And so it was nice to put in a lot of native plants that have the ability to kind of support a lot of the native pollinators that we have around the farm. So I've always looked at farms as, I think we take a lot of pride in producing food and fiber and doing it in a very, an environment with the highest regulations to protect people and the environment. But I also think it's really important that farms look for other opportunities, like how do you enhance habitat? How do you work as a partner with, we've got a compost center here with the state of, to help the state of California deal with a lot of the requirements for organic waste that's been going into landfills. So we're diverting green waste out of the landfills. We're taking it out here on the farm. We're turning it into organic certified compost within 30 days and then using that back on the farm. So that's avoiding that going into the landfills, where California figured out that's contributing about 20% of the methane emissions are coming from our landfills. And so, again, that's just another example of where can a farm be another solution partner for some of these larger picture issues. And so I think it's important that, again, you take a lot of pride in doing what we're doing in terms of, farming and providing just on that daily basis, the food and the jobs and all those, I think, are great things to do. But I always look for those other opportunities where we could maybe do some other value add like that to improve the connection to agriculture and make us be seen as more than just, just a food supplier.
Absolutely. And a big part of the sustainability equation is water. In your time with Bowles Farming Company, you've established yourself as an expert on California water. I'll make that claim for you so you don't have to make it yourself. Water can often be a contentious issue here in California, especially when we talk about the competing interest between agriculture and the environment. So if you're at a dinner party, one of your non-ag friends asks you about water and California agriculture, how would you break it down for them?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And, like you said, it is contentious. I always try to just bring us together around water. I mean, I think, the truth is we have deployed the most efficient techniques on how to grow crops, which is drip irrigation, most efficient water use techniques that we have out there available. But at the end of the day, it still takes me a certain amount of water to grow a tomato. And the amounts, when you put them down to gallons, it sounds like a lot. And so I think that's why some of our detractors like to use, big numbers and say that, agriculture is using 80% of the water, whatever the number is. I guess I would look at it as, if I'm using all the water, essentially I would be keeping all those products in some giant barn, and it would be all my tomatoes or whatever it was. But I think you